For millennia, the stars kept their secrets. Humanity gazed into the endless night, wondering if we were truly alone, sending out hopeful signals into the void and probes carrying messages of peace. We built incredible telescopes to scan the darkness for any whisper of life beyond our tiny blue marble. We found nothing, but something found us. Out in the frozen dark past Neptune, where the sun is just another pinprick of light, space itself began to rip apart. A wound of violet energy tore open the fabric of reality, then another and another, until thousands of these glowing gashes bled light into the emptiness. Through these tears in space, the ships emerged, colossal vessels of polished black metal, each one over a kilometer long, moved with chilling precision. Their hulls bristled with weapons that hummed with a lethal energy. These weren't explorers. They were conquerors. The Vareth Dominion had come. Aboard his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, High Commander Voreth Kul watched his prize approach. He was a mountain of a being, his stone-gray skin stretched over a towering frame, and his 4 orange eyes glowed with cold amusement. His ceremonial armor was crafted from the bones of conquered species, each one a trophy from a world he had broken. Each bone represented a civilization that had been ground to dust. He observed the little blue planet fill his view screen, Earth, a primitive name for a primitive world. His intelligence teams had studied these humans for 6 months, learning their simple languages, mapping their insignificant cities, and cataloging their laughable weapons: nuclear bombs, jets, tanks. The reports had made Voreth chuckle. His ships could bathe in the fires of a star. His soldiers wore armor that could shrug off an asteroid impact. These humans were still playing in the dirt while his people held dominion over 1,000 galaxies. "Remind me, Torrent, what is our current count of conquered worlds?" Voreth asked his second-in-command, a battle-scarred warrior. 247, High Commander, Torrent rumbled. "Earth will make it 248. "A minor addition," Voreth mused, "but the planet has valuable resources. We'll strip it clean and put the survivors to work in our mines." The fleet, 9,900 ships strong, pressed on. It was the largest invasion force the Dominion had ever sent for such a pathetic target. Normally 100 ships would be overkill, but Voreth was a creature of caution. You don't survive 300 years of endless war by taking chances. Besides, his troops needed the practice. So many of them were fresh recruits who had never tasted real battle. Earth would be a perfect training ground. Let them learn the art of the kill here, so they'd be ready for the wars that truly mattered. "Begin the broadcast," Voreth commanded. "All channels, every language." His communications officer complied, sending a message hurtling toward Earth at the speed of light, the same chilling ultimatum that 2,000 worlds had heard before it. "People of Earth, this is High Commander Voreth of the Vareth Dominion. Your world is now our property. You will surrender all weapons and all leaders. You will submit to our authority without question. Obey, and you will live out your days as servants. Resist, and you will be utterly annihilated. You have 1 planetary rotation to comply. This will be your only warning." 7 hours later, the message hit Earth. It flooded every radio telescope, every military command center, every television on the planet. In minutes, every government knew that the end was here. At the United Nations, world leaders convened in a panic. Presidents, prime ministers, and generals stared at the screens displaying the alien armada, a swarm of death descending on their home. "We must surrender," the French representative said, his voice trembling. "Look at the size of that fleet. We can't fight them. We can't even scratch them." "Surrender is just a prettier word for slavery," the American president shot back. Her name was Sarah Chen. A former Marine, she had lost her husband in a war 20 years prior, and her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes blazed. "I didn't get elected to hand over the human race to a pack of bullies." "And what do you propose, Madam President?" the Russian leader retorted. "Our nukes are like firecrackers against ships that can cross galaxies. Our armies may as well be throwing rocks." President Chen allowed a small, dangerous smile to cross her lips. "Let me tell you all a story," she said. 70 years ago, something crashed in the New Mexico desert, something not from this world. Our government recovered it, our scientists took it apart, and our engineers have been very, very busy ever since. She tapped her tablet, and the main view screen flickered to life, showing schematics for weapons and starships, technology that defied known physics. It was called Project Lazarus, Chen explained, and every major power in this room has a version of it. We've been getting ready for this day for generations. We never knew if they'd come as friends or as foes, so we prepared for foes. The stunned silence in the room was absolute. Leaders who had been moments from capitulation were now sitting bolt upright. A tiny, ferocious spark of hope was lit in the darkness. "Show us," the Chinese president urged. "Show us what we have." Chen nodded to a general by the door, an old soldier, scarred and silver-haired, but with the sharp eyes and coiled posture of a wolf. "I'm General Marcus Stone," he announced, his voice like gravel. "I've been in charge of Project Lazarus for 30 years. Everything you think you know about our military power is a lie. Now let me show you the truth." For the next 2 hours, he laid it all out. The fusion-powered railgun cannons hidden on the dark side of the moon. The secret fleet of 62 warships, built in vast underground caverns and deep-sea bases, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien tech. He told them about the Shiva missiles, weapons that didn't explode, but instead created miniature black holes, swallowing anything they touched. "We have 12,000 of them," Stone said grimly, "enough to extinguish suns." "Why were we never told?" the British Prime Minister demanded. "All this time we were squabbling over borders and trade deals, while you held the keys to the kingdom?" "Because the only way to keep a secret this big," President Chen cut in, "is if almost no one knows it exists. Every nation here has its own Lazarus. We've shared data covertly, coordinated defenses in the shadows, but never spoke of it openly. We always suspected someone might be listening." She glanced upward, as if she could see right through the roof to the stars beyond. "And we were right. They've been spying on us for 6 months. They think we're a weak, divided species, ripe for the picking." Her dangerous smile returned. "They have no idea how wrong they are." Millions of miles away, Vorath was becoming irritated. 20 hours had ticked by since his ultimatum. There had been no reply from the humans. "Perhaps their technology is too primitive to respond," Torrance offered. "Or maybe they didn't understand the message." "They have radio," Vorath snapped. "They've been polluting the cosmos with it for a century. They can answer. They are choosing not to." This was unusual. Every other race had responded instantly, either with terrified pleas or desperate attempts to negotiate. The humans, however, were simply silent. "What in the blazes are they doing down there?" he wondered aloud. He ordered his scout ships to take a closer look. The reports that came back only deepened the mystery. "High Commander, they're powering down," a scout pilot reported, his voice laced with confusion. "Satellites are going dark. Global communications are ceasing. It's like they're trying to hide." Vorath let out a short, harsh laugh. "Hide? From us? There's nowhere on that mudball to hide." But as the laughter died in his throat, a cold sliver of doubt pricked him. In 300 years of conquest, he'd seen it all. He'd seen species fight to the last breath. He'd seen them flee. He'd seen them beg. He had never, ever seen a species just go quiet. Down on Earth, the final pieces were moving into place. Lazarus protocols were active worldwide. Soldiers who had spent their entire careers training in secret were now deploying to their posts. Weapons that didn't officially exist were being armed and targeted. In rural Montana, a farmer named Jack Wilson watched the news on a flickering TV. At 60 years old, with calloused hands and a face carved by the sun, he figured his fighting days were long behind him. Then his phone buzzed. A voice on the other end spoke a simple code phrase he had committed to memory 40 years ago, but never thought he'd actually hear. "Lazarus is rising," the voice said. "Report to Station 7. Jack clicked off the TV. He walked out to his old barn, to the rusty tractor sitting in the corner. Reaching under the seat, he pulled out a key he had carried every single day for 4 decades. Behind the barn, buried beneath a slab of concrete hidden by layers of soil and grass, was a reinforced hatch. Jack's key unlocked it. An elevator inside carried him deep into the earth. 15 minutes later, the doors opened into a cavernous underground base, buzzing with activity. Hundreds of soldiers were already there, prepping gear that looked like it was from a science fiction movie, weapons that glowed and hummed with a power Jack couldn't name. A young officer spotted him. "Sergeant Wilson, I thought you were retired." "I made a promise, and I intend to keep it," James said, his voice raspy over the comms. He glanced at the soldiers around him, faces illuminated by the pale glow of tactical screens. Some were just kids, barely old enough to shave, their eyes wide with a terrifying mix of awe and resolve. Others, like him, were lifers, their faces etched with the lines of past conflicts. But every single one of them shared the same look, not fear, but a cold, hard determination. "So what's the game plan?" James asked the officer on screen. "We wait," the voice crackled back. "We let them get nice and close, then we unleash everything we've got, and we don't stop until they're gone, or we are." James gave a slow nod. Simple. He liked simple. "Sounds good," he said. "Count me in." High above, the silent stars wheeled in the blackness as the enemy fleet drew closer, a swarm of death descending upon an Earth that lay waiting, a coiled viper ready to strike. Aboard his flagship, High Commander Vorathkal made his call as his fleet sliced past the orbit of Mars. "I've grown tired of this waiting," he announced to his bridge. "Send in the Vanguard, 400 ships. Their mission, obliterate their military hubs and crush their major cities. We will teach them the price of defiance." His second-in-command, Torrent, shifted uncomfortably. "High Commander, their complete silence is unsettling. Perhaps a scouting mission first, to understand what we're facing." Vorathkal cut him off with a wave of his hand. "I have brought 2,000 worlds to heal, Torrent. I don't need to understand these primitives. I only need to break them. Send the Vanguard, now." As commanded, 400 sleek, deadly ships peeled away from the main fleet, accelerating toward the blue planet. They were the fastest, most lethal ships in his armada, armed with plasma cannons that could turn mountains into molten slag, each carrying 1,000 warriors hungry for conquest. They crossed the orbit of the moon at precisely 0347 Greenwich Mean Time. At 0348, the moon shot back. The first projectile was a 50-meter-long tungsten rod fired from a hidden railgun at 8% of the speed of light. At that velocity, it carried more raw kinetic energy than any nuclear weapon humanity had ever conceived. It struck the lead alien vessel before its crew could even register the threat. The ship didn't explode in a fireball. It simply ceased to be. 1 second, a warship, the next an expanding cloud of superheated atoms. A heartbeat later, more slugs followed. 10, then 20, then 50, then 100. They erupted from craters that looked dormant, from mountain ranges that seemed lifeless, and from secret bases that the governments of Earth had sworn on stacks of holy books didn't exist. 12 of Vorathkal's ships vanished in the first 3 seconds. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, alarm shrieked in protest. "What is happening?" Vorathkal roared. "Report!" Torrent's eyes were wide with disbelief. "It's their moon! They have weapons concealed on the moon. Railguns, High Commander, firing projectiles at .08 light speed. Our shields can't—" He was cut off by another, more frantic alert. From the surface of Earth, thousands of missiles were rising to meet them. But these weren't the crude nuclear rockets the invaders had anticipated. These missiles moved wrong. They seemed to flicker in and out of existence, twisting in ways that drove the targeting computers completely mad. "I can't get a lock," a weapons officer yelled, his voice strained. "It's like they're bending light around themselves. Our sensors can't get a clear reading." The ghost-like missiles reached the Vanguard and began to detonate, but they didn't burst with fire or shrapnel. They bloomed with pure darkness. Where each warhead went off, a tiny sphere of absolute blackness appeared for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, it devoured everything it touched: ships, energy shields, armor plating, and the crew inside. Nothing survived contact. Vorathkal watched in stunned horror as his elite Vanguard was ripped to shreds. Ships that had survived legendary battles against galactic empires were being unmade like they were paper. Crews that had conquered entire star systems were dying without a clue what was killing them. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Those weapons, their singularities, miniature artificial black holes. That technology shouldn't exist," Torrent breathed beside him. "Even we haven't perfected that." But the humans had. For 70 years, they had labored in secret labs buried deep beneath mountains and hidden under the crushing pressure of the oceans. They'd failed 1,000 times over. They'd accidentally erased research teams in a dozen different catastrophic accidents. But they never stopped. They kept trying, kept learning, and kept building. And now, they were finally unleashing their terrible creations upon the enemy who had come to put them in chains. 90 minutes after the moon fired its first shot, the vanguard was annihilated. Of the 400 ships sent, less than 200 remained, and those survivors were scrambling back to the main fleet, their crews screaming warnings that sounded like pure fantasy. Vorethkol slumped in his command chair, all four of his eyes wide with a shock he had never known. In 300 years of conquest, he had never lost a single battle. In 300 years, he had never once been taken by surprise. In one night, the humans had delivered both. Torrent approached him cautiously. "High Commander, your orders?" Vorethkol was silent for a long, terrifying moment. He considered retreat. He considered caution. He considered every strategic lesson learned over centuries of warfare. And then he thought about the Dominion Council and what they would do to a commander who returned home, defeated by a species they'd labeled as primitives. His face hardened, all emotion burned away. "All ships," he said, his voice like ice. "Full assault. Every weapon, every soldier. We will overwhelm them with numbers. We will drown them in fire." He rose to his feet, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't care how many ships we lose. I don't care how many of our soldiers die," he snarled. "We will scour this world until nothing remains but ash and silence." The order blasted across the fleet. 9,000 warships began their grim advance toward Earth, their weapon ports glowing, their crews steeling themselves for the battle to come. They had no idea they were flying into a meat grinder. They had no idea that most of them would never fly again. They had no idea they had finally found a species that would rather burn its own world to the ground than kneel before an invader. And down on the surface of the moon, an old soldier named Captain James Morrison watched the enemy fleet fill his screens and allowed himself a grim, small smile. His railguns were hot, his crews were ready, and the enemy was walking right into his kill box. "You wanted a war," he muttered into the darkness of the command center. "Well, you've got one. Now let's see who's got more blood to spare." He slammed a large red button, and the moon's guns began to sing their song of destruction once more. The war for Earth had truly begun. The space around the planet was already turning into a graveyard. Chunks of twisted metal that were once warships tumbled through the void. Bodies, flash-frozen in the vacuum, drifted silently amidst the wreckage. Inside shattered hulls, fire still raged where pockets of oxygen remained. It was a scene from a child's nightmare, and it was only getting started. High Commander Vorethkol stood on the bridge of the Eternal Conquest, watching his massive fleet descend. 9,000 warships, a tide of steel and fury, moved in perfect deadly formation. Behind them, the smoldering ruins of his vanguard served as a grim testament to the fight that lay ahead. "Give me a status report," Vorethkol commanded. "The moon's defenses are still firing," Torrent replied, his tone clipped. "They've taken out another 60 ships on our approach. Our shields are holding against their slugs, but just barely. We have to divert all power to maintain them." "Then we won't need them for long," Vorethkol shot back. "Order the assault carriers to begin landing operations. Get our soldiers on the ground. Let's see how these humans fight us face to face." He flashed a smile that was all sharp, predatory teeth. On the ground, his warriors were unstoppable. No secret superweapon could save the humans from millions of Varath shock troopers in powered battle armor. The massive assault carriers broke from the main formation and plunged into the atmosphere. Each ship was a flying fortress, carrying 10,000 soldiers and hundreds of war machines. Their armor was forged to withstand orbital strikes, their shields designed to stop any weapon the humans had revealed so far. At least, that's what the Varath believed. In a bunker buried deep beneath Washington, D.C., President Sarah Chen watched the enemy's descent on a massive wall of screens. "They're landing," General Stone stated, his voice a low rumble. 12 carriers touching down over North America alone, more across Europe, Asia, Africa. They're trying to establish multiple fronts at once. "Then we'll meet them on every front," Chen said, her voice calm and cold as steel. "Activate all Lazarus ground units. And General—" "Yes, Madam President?" he asked. "Authorize Protocol Chimera. Tell our people they have permission to use everything in the playbook. No restrictions, whatever it takes." Stone gave a sharp nod. He knew exactly what she meant. The secret weapons they'd built were monstrous things, some designed to fight aliens, others designed for wars between humans, conflicts so terrible no one had ever dared to start them. Until now. "God help us all," Stone whispered. "God helps those who help themselves, General," President Chen replied, her eyes locked on the screen. "Let's get to helping." The first Varath assault carrier touched down in the Nevada desert near the glassed-over ruins of Las Vegas. The city was already a wasteland from the initial bombardment, its famous strip of lights now just a trail of ash and rubble. The Varath saw it as the perfect landing zone, flat, open, with plenty of space to deploy their armies. They had no idea the desert itself was waiting to devour them. Commander Rexith was the first one down the ramp. Young for a Varath officer at only 80 years old, his armor was pristine, untested in the fires of real combat. He was eager to claim his first victory. "Fan out," he barked at his soldiers. "Secure a perimeter. We march on the nearest human settlement at dawn." His troops moved with flawless, disciplined precision, their weapons raised, their helmet sensors sweeping the silent landscape. They found nothing. The desert was dead quiet, just sand, rock, and the skeletons of broken buildings. Rexith scowled. Where were the humans? Had they run? Were these primitives too cowardly to even fight? And then the entire desert floor erupted. Mines, thousands of them, hidden just beneath the sand. But they weren't your typical explosives. These detonated with focused bursts of plasma, with crippling electromagnetic pulses, and with concentrated beams of light that sliced through Varath battle armor as if it were tissue paper. In the first few seconds, hundreds of his soldiers were vaporized where they stood. Screams and static flooded the radio channels as their bodies dropped and never got up again. "Ambush!" Rexith roared into his comm. "Take cover! Fire back!" But there was nothing to shoot at. The mines were automated, set off by movement and body heat. The humans who planted them were miles away, safe in underground bunkers, watching the slaughter on camera. Then came the drones. They were tiny, no bigger than birds, and they swarmed by the thousands, moving so fast our sensors could barely register them. Each one carried just a few grams of explosives packed around a metal core. By themselves, they were harmless, but together, they were a storm of death that slammed into the Varath soldiers. They zipped into the gaps in their armor, flew into air vents, and slipped into the soft tissue between helmet and neck. They detonated in tiny, precise bursts of fire and shrapnel, killing not with brute force but with surgical accuracy. Rexith watched his army get torn apart. He'd landed with 2,000 soldiers. 10 minutes later, half of them were gone. The survivors were pinned down, hiding behind whatever they could find, shooting blindly at an enemy they couldn't see. "Requesting orbital support," Rex screamed. "We need a bombardment. We need—" A drone flew right into his open mouth. He never finished the sentence. All over the world, the same nightmare was unfolding. The Vath had expected a quick, easy conquest. What they found was a planet-sized death trap. In Germany, human soldiers in advanced exoskeletons ambushed a landing party in the Black Forest. They moved like ghosts through the trees, materializing out of nowhere to fire a single, devastating shot before melting back into the shadows. The Varath couldn't catch them, couldn't even pin them down. Every time they thought they had them cornered, the humans were already gone. In China, the invasion force touched down in the Gobi Desert, only to find 1 million human soldiers waiting for them in fortified positions. But these weren't just walls of dirt and steel. They were built from smart materials that could heal themselves, shifting and reshaping to deflect incoming attacks. The Vareth unleashed everything they had, and the walls just held. Down in Brazil, the Amazon rainforest itself came alive, a jungle full of traps and ambushes. Trees would explode if you got too close. Rivers were laced with chemicals that dissolved Vareth armor on contact. Even the animals were weapons, fitted with tiny cameras and explosives, turning the entire ecosystem into a living minefield. And no matter where they were, the human soldiers fought with a ferocity the Vareth simply couldn't comprehend. On the bridge of the flagship, the Eternal Conquest, Vorthal watched the casualty reports pour in. His face was a mask of stone, betraying nothing. But inside, his mind was screaming. "Impossible," he whispered to himself. "This is completely impossible." "We've lost 200,000 soldiers in the first day," his second-in-command Torrent reported, his voice trembling. "Ground Commander Yexeth is dead. So are Commanders Rexath, Belor, Seneth, and 47 other senior officers. Our ground forces are begging for immediate evacuation." "Denied," Vorthal said flatly. "They will hold their ground. Send in the reinforcements." "High Commander, if we send more troops down there, they'll just die. The humans have turned their entire world into a weapon. Every forest, desert, and city is a kill box. We can't fight an enemy that we can't even find." "Then we'll burn their hiding places to the ground," Vorthal snarled. "We'll turn their deserts to glass. We will level every city until there's nowhere left for them to hide." He turned to his weapons officer. "Begin orbital bombardment. Maximum firepower. I want that entire planet turned to ash." The weapons officer paused. "High Commander, our orders from the Council were to take the planet intact." "The Council isn't here," Vorthal shot back. "I am, and I'm ordering you to burn it all." The command went out. Across the entire fleet, massive plasma cannons began to whine as they charged up. Targeting systems locked onto cities, forests, and oceans. The Vareth were about to wipe Earth off the star charts. But the humans had one last surprise. Deep inside a command center buried beneath the Rocky Mountains, built to withstand a full-scale nuclear war, Admiral Chen Wei watched the enemy fleet power up its weapons. She was the commander of Earth's secret space force, a fleet of 62 ships built in total secrecy over the last 4 decades. She was also President Chen's little sister. "They're charging their main cannons," her tactical officer announced. "Estimated time to fire is 2 minutes. "Then we have 2 minutes to give them hell," Chen Wei replied, her voice calm. "Order all ships to launch, maximum speed, attack pattern Omega. Admiral, we're outnumbered 150 to 1. If we engage them now, we'll be annihilated." "And if we don't," she countered, standing up from her chair, "Earth will be." She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she had the presence of a giant. "I didn't build this fleet to cower in a hole while my world burns. Launch the ships." "Yes, Admiral." All across the globe, hidden doors slid open. From the mountains of Colorado, from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and from the frozen wastes of Antarctica, warships began to rise. They were pitch black, shaped like arrowheads, and coated in materials the Vareth sensors didn't even recognize. They flew on gravity drives, a technology humans had reverse-engineered from that crashed ship in New Mexico all those years ago. They moved with no rockets, no exhaust, and no sound. They just ascended into the sky, accelerating faster than anything humanity had ever built before. In 3 minutes, they were in orbit. In 4, they were tearing through the enemy fleet. The Vareth never even saw them coming. Admiral Chen Wei's flagship, the UES Defiance, fired the first shot. A concentrated beam of gravity hit a Vareth cruiser and crushed it like an empty can. The massive warship just crumpled in on itself, its armor and shields completely useless against a weapon that attacked space itself. "All ships engage," Chen Wei ordered. "Take out their weapon systems first. Do not let them fire on Earth." The human fleet scattered through the Varath Armada like a pack of wolves let loose in a sheep pen. They were smaller, faster, and far more agile than the enemy ships. They weaved between the colossal Varath warships, getting in close to fire at point-blank range where the shields were weakest. The Varath tried to fight back, filling the void with plasma fire and swarms of missiles. But the human ships were almost impossible to hit. They juked and twisted, using their gravity drives to pull off maneuvers that defied physics. Shots that should have been dead-on missed by feet, then by inches, as human pilots pushed their ships to the absolute edge. And even when the Varath did land a hit, it didn't go as they expected. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo was piloting a small attack ship called the Scorpion. She was 26 years old, born and raised in Lagos, and had been recruited into the secret fleet when she was just 18. She'd spent the last 8 years training for this very moment. A Varath destroyer locked onto her and unleashed a full barrage of plasma bolts. Her shields flared bright and then died. Alarms blared as her hull started to melt. "Shields are gone," she reported, her voice steady. "Hull integrity is at 40%. Weapons are still online." "Fall back," her squadron leader ordered. "Get out of there, Scorpion." "Negative. I'm going for their command ship. I'm taking it out." She slammed the throttle forward, and the Scorpion shot toward the destroyer, trailing smoke and fire. The Varath crew watched her coming and tried to turn, but their ship was just too slow. Okonkwo lined up her shot on the destroyer's engine section. At the very last second, she fired everything she had, 4 graviton missiles, each one powerful enough to crack a small moon. Then she yanked her ship up, the frame groaning in protest, and flew right through the fireball of the destroyer's exploding reactor. She made it out the other side, her ship a wreck, but she was alive. Behind her, the enemy destroyer was nothing but a cloud of 1,000,000 pieces. "Target destroyed," she reported. "Scorpion is barely holding together, but I'm ready for the next one." That same scene played out all across the battlefield. Human pilots fought with a desperate courage that the Vath had never seen before. When their ships took damage, they didn't retreat. They fought harder. When they ran out of ammo, they used their ships as battering rams. And when they had absolutely nothing left, they'd eject and fire their pistols at enemy command bridges as they floated by. It was pure insanity. It was suicidal. And it was working. "They're not backing down," Torrin said, his voice laced with a strange kind of awe. "No matter how many we destroy, they just keep coming." "What kind of species is this?" "A species of fools," Vorthal replied. But for the first time, he could hear the doubt in his own voice. The battle raged for hours. The human fleet was taking heavy losses, their numbers shrinking with every passing minute. But for every single human ship they lost, they took a dozen Varath ships with them. The cold, hard math of war was starting to tilt in a way Vorthal had never imagined possible. By the end of that first day, the human fleet had lost 38 ships. Only 24 were left, all of them damaged, their crews running on nothing but adrenaline and pure rage. The Varath fleet, however, had lost 800 ships. Vorthal stared at those numbers, and for the first time in centuries, he felt something cold and unfamiliar creep into his heart. Fear. It was genuine fear. "We have to pull back," Torrin urged. "We need to regroup. Our fleet is in chaos, and our ground forces are being butchered. We need to come up with new tactics." "And give them time to rebuild? To make more of those weapons?" Vor slammed his fist on the console. "No," he growled. "We keep hitting them. We throw everything we've got at that pathetic little fleet until it shatters." His subordinate hesitated. "High Commander, with all due respect, I don't think they're going to break. I've been studying them. They don't fight like anyone we've ever met. They're not fighting for land or for glory. They're fighting simply because they refuse to lose. They would rather burn to atoms than surrender." Vor sneered. "Then they'll get their wish." "Yes," the officer replied quietly. "But how many of us will they take with them?" Vorthal had no answer. Back on Earth, President Chen read the grim report from her sister's fleet. 38 ships gone, thousands of brave pilots lost, but for now, the enemy's bombardment of the planet had stopped. "How much time did they buy us?" she asked General Stone, her voice heavy. "Days," he said, his face etched with exhaustion. "Maybe a week if we get a miracle. Our pilots are running on fumes, the ships are barely holding together, and we've already fired almost half of our Shiva missiles. Once they're gone, we're back to fighting with pop guns." He pointed to a map of the planet's surface. "Our ground forces are holding, but they're taking a beating. The enemy drops more troops every single hour. It's only a matter of time before they just bury us in bodies." Chen closed her eyes, a wave of despair washing over her. She knew this was coming. The moment she first saw their fleet blot out the stars, she knew humanity probably couldn't win. They were too strong, too many, their technology light years ahead of their own. But she also knew that humanity would fight anyway, because that's what humans do. They spit in the face of impossible odds. They rage against the dying of the light. They never, ever go quietly. "Keep fighting," she ordered, her voice firm again. "Every hour you hold them off is another hour for our scientists to cook up a miracle. Every ship you take down is one less they can use against our homes. Make them pay for every single inch of this world in blood." "Yes, Madam President." Chen opened her eyes and focused on the screen showing her sister's flagship, the Defiance. Its hull was scorched and cracked, a wounded beast, but it was still flying, still fighting. A tiny, fierce smile touched her lips. "Give 'em hell, little sister," she whispered. "Make them remember us." And in the silent, frozen darkness of space, the brutal dance continued. Ships on both sides were ripped apart by the dozens. Pilots screamed their last words into the uncaring vacuum. Explosions lit up the void like a terrifying new sun. The first day of the war for Earth was over, but the slaughter had only just begun. The Varath had come expecting to swat a fly. They were quickly learning they had kicked a hornet's nest. Humans weren't primitive. They weren't weak. They were something else entirely. Humans were survivors, and they would fight until the very last one was gone. In the hours that followed, both sides licked their wounds and reloaded. The Varath called in reinforcements, fresh ships from the back of their massive fleet. The humans patched what they could with spit and prayers, rearming every weapon they had left. Nobody knew how long this would last. Nobody knew who would be left standing at the end. But they all knew one thing. This war would be remembered as long as the stars still burned. This war would change the galaxy forever. And somewhere in the blackness between worlds, 17, Varath ships would one day limp home, their crews forever haunted, desperate to tell the tale of what they saw. But that was still days away. For now, there was only fire, blood, and the endless screams of the dying. The second day began with hellfire raining from the sky. High Commander Vorath Kul had made his choice. If these humans wanted a real fight, he'd give them a fight they'd never forget. "Every ship in the fleet with a weapon," he commanded, "will attack now. Every gun will fire. Every soldier will land. We will drown this pathetic planet in its own blood." He pointed a clawed finger at the blue marble on his view screen. "All ships advance. Target their population centers. I want their cities burning. I want their people screaming. I want them to know that hope is dead." 9,000 ships surged forward, a tidal wave of metal and death. The moon's defense batteries fired frantically, their railgun slugs punching clean through enemy hulls, but it was like throwing pebbles at a mountain. For every ship they destroyed, 10 more took its place. The human fleet, what was left of it, rose to meet them. 24 ships against 9,000. It wasn't a battle. It was suicide. Admiral Chen Wei knew it. Her crew knew it. But they flew out anyway. "All ships," she ordered, her voice steady as a rock. "Target their troop carriers. We need to stop them from landing any more soldiers. If we can't win in space, we'll make our stand on the ground." The Defiance led the charge, its hull a patchwork of scars from the day before. Temporary plates covered gaping holes where missiles had torn through its armor. Half its guns were offline. Its shields flickered at a pathetic 30%. None of it mattered to Chen Wei. "Fire," she said simply. The ship's main gun roared. A beam of pure gravity shot out and hit a Vareth carrier, crushing it like a tin can. The ship's smaller guns opened up, shredding the carrier's escorts. Swarms of missiles flew out, each one carrying a microscopic black hole that could devour anything it touched. All around her, the tiny human fleet did the same. They moved through the enemy formation like sharks, biting and tearing and killing with a ferocity the Vareth had never seen. But sheer numbers are a weapon all their own. The first human ship to fall was the Spirit of Tokyo. It was hammered by concentrated fire from 6 enemy destroyers, its shields vanishing in a blink. With his last breath, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka fired one final volley and then aimed his exploding ship at the nearest enemy carrier. His death took 300 of the enemy with him. The Pride of Nigeria died next, then the Moscow's Fury, then the Amazon Dawn. One by one, the lights of humanity's defenders winked out. Their crews died at their posts, still firing, still fighting, still refusing to give in. Admiral Chen Wei watched her fleet get torn to pieces around her. She had known this would happen. She had accepted it, but knowing it and watching it were two very different things. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, her voice strained, "we've lost 12 ships. We only have 12 left. We can't keep this up." "We can, and we will," Chen Wei shot back. "As long as we're fighting up here, they're not turning our cities to glass. Every minute we buy them is another 1,000,000 lives saved." She turned to her comms officer. "Get me a channel to every ship." Her voice rang with pride. Tell them I am so proud of them. Tell them that no matter what happens today, we have already won. The enemy came here expecting sheep. We've shown them that humans are not sheep. We are wolves." The message blazed across the comms. On every bridge, exhausted crews heard their admiral's words and found a new reserve of strength. "All ships," Chen Wei continued, her eyes locked on the massive enemy flagship. "Form up on me. We're going to hit them where they live. If we're going to die, we're taking their commander with us." The 12 battered, smoking ships gathered around the Defiance. They were barely flying, but they formed a perfect spearhead and began their final, desperate charge toward the enemy command ship, the Eternal Conquest. Vor saw them coming. He had been watching these insane humans fight for hours, and he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in centuries: respect. They were absolute fools, but they were the bravest fools he had ever encountered. "They're coming straight for us," his second-in-command observed, stating the obvious. 12 ships against our entire fleet. They have to know this is pointless." "Oh, they know," Vorthul said, a strange tone in his voice. "They just don't care. Order all ships to concentrate fire. End this farce before they get any closer." The entire Vareth fleet turned its guns on the 12 charging ships. Thousands of weapons fired at once, turning the space around the human fleet into a raging storm of plasma and light. The European Unity was the first to vaporize, then the Cairo Star, then the Sol Phoenix. Chen Wei watched her ships die and just kept flying straight ahead. 8 ships left, 7, 6. "Admiral, we're not going to make it," her helmsman gasped, his knuckles white on the controls. "There's too many of them." "Then we will die trying," Chen Wei replied calmly. "Full speed, all remaining weapons, fire at will." The Defiance shuddered violently as it took hit after hit. Fires erupted across the ship. The lights flickered and died. Alarms blared from every speaker. 4 ships left, 3, 2, and then there was only the Defiance. "All other ships are gone, Admiral," the tactical officer reported. Her voice was strangely peaceful. She had accepted her fate. They all had. "Distance to the enemy flagship?" Chen Wei asked. 50 kilometers and closing, came the reply. Too far, way too far. The Defiance was being torn apart. It would never reach the Eternal Conquest. The final desperate charge had failed, or so it seemed. A cold, chilling smile spread across Chen Wei's face. It was the smile of someone who had one last terrible card to play. "Helm, new course," she commanded. "Take us toward that cluster of troop carriers on our right." "Ma'am?" "Just do it." The Defiance lurched, turning away from the flagship and rocketing toward a dense formation of Vareth ships carrying soldiers down to Earth. Those were the reinforcements that would have overwhelmed her people. "Arm the self-destruct," Chen Wei ordered. "Set it for maximum yield." Her first officer looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Admiral, if we detonate our reactor, in the middle of them—" "I know exactly what will happen," she cut him off. "Set the self-destruct." "Yes, ma'am." The Defiance dove toward the carriers like a divine thunderbolt. The Vareth fired everything they had, but the ship was moving too fast, too erratically. It was a dead ship flying, and nothing was going to stop it. Chen Wei stood up from her command chair. She looked at her bridge crew, the brave men and women who had become her family. They looked back, their faces filled not with fear, but with pride. "It has been an honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The honor was all ours, Admiral," her first officer replied for all of them. The Defiance plunged into the heart of the carrier formation, and then Admiral Chen Wei gave her final order. For Earth. The ship's core went critical, unleashing a contained black hole that didn't just explode. It unraveled reality. It swallowed the nearest troop carriers, then their reactors chained together, feeding the singularity, pulling in dozens, then hundreds of Vareth ships, including the distant, horrified flagship. For a moment, a new star burned in the sky over Earth, a star of pure defiance. And then there was only silence, and a gaping wound in the Vareth armada. The invasion was broken. Earth was saved. President Chen stood in the bunker, her face a mask of stone, but inside, her world was ending. The report was blunt. Her sister, Admiral Chen Wei, had just detonated her own flagship's reactor, sacrificing the entire human space fleet in a final, desperate act of defiance. The blast had been biblical, wiping out 12 enemy carriers and crippling 20 more, taking nearly 1,000 alien ships with them. 50,000 Vareth soldiers gone in a flash. But it wasn't enough. Our entire fleet was dust, and now absolutely nothing stood between the Vareth armada and Earth. It was an unprovoked attack, a calculated extermination, and we were the underdogs facing extinction. But what the aliens didn't count on was that our most terrifying weapons weren't in space. Stick around to see how humanity fights back from the brink. When the messenger finally finished, the president allowed herself a single, silent moment. Her sister was gone, her last family member. But grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was the president, and she had a planet to save. "General Stone, report," she said, her voice steady. 3 million have landed, ma'am, with more every hour. They're steamrolling our defenses in North America and Europe." He hesitated. "And our other assets? The ground weapons we've never used?" The general's face was grim. "Madam President, if we unleash those, the collateral damage will be catastrophic. We're talking millions of our own people." He didn't have to say the alternative. They both knew what would happen if the Vareth weren't stopped. "Use them," President Chen ordered, her voice cold as ice. "God forgive us, but use them." "Yes, Madam President." The weapons she spoke of were humanity's darkest secrets, terrifying creations we'd built and prayed we'd never have to unleash. We're talking about bombs designed to release plagues that targeted only Vareth biology, machines that could trigger earthquakes under enemy armies, and orbital platforms that could focus sunlight into a city-melting death ray. These were weapons of true mass destruction, and the switch was about to be flipped. Miles away in the Nevada desert, Commander Zareth, a Vareth officer, swaggered in his tank. His force was unstoppable, 50,000 soldiers and 200 vehicles, rolling toward what was left of Los Angeles. The humans had fled before him like insects, victory felt inevitable. And then the sky turned pure white. Zareth glanced up, confused. The sun, it looked like it was growing, focusing into an intense, blinding point. A beam of pure, shimmering heat shot down from the sky and slammed into the heart of his tank column. The temperature skyrocketed past anything their advanced armor could handle. Tanks liquefied into glowing puddles of slag. Soldiers were cooked alive inside their suits. The desert sand beneath them flash-fused into a sheet of black glass. Zareth's own tank was on the edge of the beam, and he barely managed to crawl out, half his body scorched black. Lying on the smoldering ground, watching his invincible army vanish, he could only whisper, "What? What is this?" He'd never get an answer. A kilometer away, a human sniper hidden in the ruins put a bullet right through the alien commander's head. That was just the beginning. All across the planet, the Vareth were getting one nasty surprise after another. In Moscow, their occupying force suddenly started gasping, coughing up their own lungs as a custom-tailored plague ripped through their ranks. 50,000 of them were dead in hours. In Japan, the ground beneath a Vareth base began to shake violently. Our earthquake machines, buried years ago, had been activated, tearing open massive chasms that swallowed soldiers and armor whole. And in Africa, swarms of nanobots, invisible to the naked eye, descended on an entire Vareth army. These microscopic machines were programmed to do one thing: consume Vareth biology and technology. They ate through armor, then flesh and bone. An army of 100,000 was reduced to a field of skeletons in under an hour. The Vareth had planned for nukes and missiles. They had no idea we'd turned our entire planet into a death trap. On their command ship, High Commander Vorethel was panicking. What are they doing? What are these weapons? His scientists were terrified. High Commander, the humans have been preparing for this for decades. These weapons are designed specifically for us. The plague, the nanobots. They target our unique DNA. Even the earthquake machines, one analyst stammered. They were placed exactly where our invasion models predicted we would gather. How did they know? Vorethel demanded. The scientist shook his head. They didn't. They put them everywhere. High Commander, their entire planet is the weapon. A cold dread washed over Vorethel. He'd lost over 1,000 ships and nearly 1,000,000 ground troops, and they'd barely secured a foothold. We should retreat, his second-in-command urged. Regroup, study these weapons, and come back stronger. No, Vorethel roared. We've come too far. The Dominion Council will execute us for failure. He turned to the communications officer, his eyes wild with rage and fear. Order all ships to commence full orbital bombardment. Target everything, their cities, their weapon sites, their people. If they want to fight dirty, we will show them filth, burn their world until nothing is left but ash. But High Commander, our orders. The Council isn't here, Vorethel screamed, his composure completely shattered. I am, and I order you to burn this planet to the ground. The order went out. The remaining ships in the Vareth fleet began to power their main cannons. But humanity had one last trick up its sleeve. Deep in a secret bunker under the Colorado mountains, a weapon unlike any other was powering up. It wasn't a bomb or a plague. It was something that broke the laws of physics. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the genius behind Project Prometheus, had spent 30 years of her life on this device. It was a machine that could literally tear a hole in the fabric of space-time. Is the facility clear? She asked her young assistant, Maria. Yes, doctor. Everyone's evacuated but us. Then let's turn it on. Maria hesitated. Doctor, we've never tested it at full power. We have no idea what it will really do. Rodriguez gave a small, sad smile. Oh, I know exactly what it will do. We're going to create a wound in reality itself, a wound that will swallow every single enemy ship in orbit. And us with it? Maria asked softly. And us with it, Rodriguez confirmed. It has to be controlled manually to the very end. There's no other way. She looked at her assistant. Go, Maria. Get out of here. I can finish this. The young woman stood taller. No, I'll stay. Someone has to monitor the power levels. Besides, she added quietly, I have no one waiting for me out there. This is a good way to go. Rodriguez looked at her with immense gratitude, then nodded. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Doctor. They turned to their consoles and began the final sequence. Above them, plasma bolts rained from the sky, melting cities and boiling oceans. Millions of lives were extinguished in seconds. But deep underground, two scientists watched their monitors, waiting for the perfect moment. "The fleet is clustering," Maria reported. "They're focusing their fire on the east coast, right above us." "Perfect," Rodriguez said, her fingers flying across the keys. "They've gathered for their own execution. Activate it, Maria. Now!" Maria slammed the button. For a split second, nothing happened. Then every alarm shrieked at once as the energy readings went off the charts. The whole mountain began to groan and shake. "It's working," Rodriguez whispered in awe. "It's actually working." In orbit, the Verith fleet was suddenly and violently yanked sideways. Alarms blared on every bridge as their ships were pulled by an invisible, irresistible force. Engines strained and bucked, but it was no use. Ship after ship was dragged toward the center of their formation, where reality itself was coming apart. A hole of pure, silent blackness was opening in space. It wasn't a wormhole. It was a wound, an absence of everything that drank light and matter and time itself. "What is that?" High Commander Vorthal shrieked from his command chair as his own ship began to creak and groan under the strain. "Unknown," his officer cried out. "Our sensors can't even read it. It's eating the fleet." The hole grew, and the chain reaction started. The immense energy of the dying ships fed the anomaly, making it stronger, bigger, and hungrier. It didn't just swallow 300 ships, it swallowed them all. Vorthal's last moments were a scream of pure terror as he watched the blackness consume his viewport, tearing his flagship apart, atom by atom. Deep underground, Dr. Rodriguez and Maria were vaporized in the backlash, their sacrifice saving billions. On the ground, the remaining Verith soldiers looked up to see their fleet, their entire armada, vanish from the sky. They were stranded, leaderless, terrified. They had come as conquerors, expecting to crush a primitive world. Instead, they had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a planet. President Chen watched the report on the main screen, her face unreadable. The war was over. Earth was scarred, bleeding and mourning millions, but it was safe. We had won. The cost was unimaginable, but the moral of the story was burned into the stars for any other would-be conquerors to see. You can push humanity into a corner, but you will not like what comes out. What do you do when you can't win? If you're the alien race known as the Verith, you decide to just burn the whole planet to the ground. That's the impossible situation humanity found itself in. For generations, the scars of this war would mar our world. But we never lost hope. In underground bunkers and hidden caves, in the skeletons of our cities and the ash of our forests, we fought on. We'd hit their patrols, sabotage their gear, and die by the thousands. But for every one of us they took, we took 10 of them. The Verith came expecting a quick conquest. What they found was a species that would rather be annihilated than kneel. And the real fight was just getting started. Stick around to see how we decided to give them a war they'd never forget. By the 4th day, High Commander Vorith had given up on sleep. He just stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, watching tactical maps with eyes completely hollowed out by exhaustion. The numbers flickering on those screens were telling him a story that his mind refused to accept. A story that defied all logic. He had shown up at Earth with 9,900 ships. He was now down to less than 7,000. Over 3,000 warships, each one a pinnacle of Verith technology, had been vaporized by a species that shouldn't have been able to dent their hulls. Another patrol was just wiped out in the southern part of the Asian continent, his second-in-command, Torrent, reported. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. He was just a machine reciting facts now, too worn down to feel a thing. 500 soldiers gone. The humans used some sort of chemical agent that ate right through their armor. "What kind of chemical?" Vorith demanded. "Our scientists are still running the analysis," Torrent replied. "It looks like it's based on fluorine compounds, incredibly corrosive, and it seems to be specifically designed to react with the alloys in our armor." "How are they inventing new weapons this fast?" Vorith whispered. Torrent didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The truth was, the Verith had never run into anything like humanity before. Every other species they conquered fought in a predictable way. They had organized armies with leaders you could target. Their weapons were developed in government facilities. They used tactics from a playbook. Humans threw the playbook out the window. In every ruined city, every small town, every hidden refugee camp, people were inventing. Scientists who had never even heard of each other were tackling the same problems and coming up with dozens of different, deadly solutions. Soldiers were taking apart their guns on the battlefield, cobbling together new weapons from scrap metal and alien tech. Teenagers were literally building bombs in their basements. It was absolute chaos. It was pure insanity, and it was terrifyingly effective. An engineer hiding out in Buenos Aires figured out a weakness in the Varith shield generators. Within hours, that intel was shared across the entire planet through a secret web of communication networks. By sunset, every human fighter knew exactly how to bypass their shields. A chemist in Mumbai developed a compound that could melt Varith armor like plastic. Within a few days, makeshift factories all over India were pumping it out and shipping it to the front lines around the globe. A kid in Seoul figured out how to hack their communication channels. Suddenly, human commanders could hear every single order the aliens gave. The Varith had conquered 2,000 planets. On every single one, they had faced a traditional military, cut off the leadership, and the army crumbled. But humanity had no single leader. They were a hydra. You cut off one head, and 10 more grew in its place. You leveled one city, and 100 villages would rise up to continue the fight. "They're learning faster than we can adapt," Torrance said, his voice grim. "Our strategies are useless within hours. They're countering our weapons almost as fast as we can deploy them. I've never witnessed anything like it." "Then we have to do something they can't counter," Vorith snarled. "Something permanent." "What are you suggesting?" Torrance asked. Vorith turned to his chief science officer. "How long would it take to crack this planet's crust? 'Cause enough geological chaos to make the surface completely unlivable?" The science officer turned ghost white. "High Commander, that would sterilize the entire planet. It would be decades before the surface was stable again. We'd gain nothing but a dead rock." "Right now," Vorith shot back, "I'd take a dead rock over this nightmare. How long?" "It would take roughly 2 days of non-stop concentrated orbital bombardment. We'd have to target the major tectonic fault lines." "Then do it," Vorith commanded. Torrance stepped forward. "High Commander, I have to object. The Dominion Council sent us here to take this planet, not obliterate it. If we go back with a pile of rubble, they'll have us executed," Torrance argued. "If we don't go back at all," Vorith retorted, "we won't have to worry about an execution." He turned to face his second-in-command squarely. "We are losing, Torrance. I see it. You see it. Every officer in this fleet sees it. We can't win this world with a ground war. So, we either crack it open, or we turn tail and admit we were beaten." "Then maybe we should retreat," Torrance pressed. "Go back and tell the Council that a bunch of primitives drove us off, that 9,000 warships weren't enough to take one tiny planet." Vorith just shook his head. "No, I would rather die right here than live with that shame. My decision is final. Begin the bombardment." Torrance stared at his commander for a long, heavy moment. He saw something in Vorith's eyes he'd never seen before. It wasn't just fatigue or anger. It was something deeper, something shattered. Vorith had been a conqueror for 300 years. His entire life, his whole identity, was built on victory. The very possibility that he could fail was eating him alive from the inside out. Finally, Torrance gave a slow, reluctant nod. "As you command, High Commander." He turned to relay the order, knowing it was a death sentence for every living thing on the planet below. Billions of humans, most of them just ordinary people, were about to be erased for the simple crime of refusing to surrender. But Torrance was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders, or so he had always believed. On Earth, human intelligence intercepted the Varith communications almost instantly. That teenage hacker in Seoul had done his job better than anyone knew. The report reached President Shen within minutes. She listened to the translated recording of Vorith's command, and she felt the blood turn to ice in her veins. "They're going to shatter the planet," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They know they can't beat us, so they're going to murder us all. Madam President, we have to do something, General Stone urged. We can't stop an orbital bombardment like that. Our weapons can't reach their fleet, and we have no ships left in space. I know, she replied. Then what's the move? Shen was quiet for a long time. She thought about her sister, who had died in the cold vacuum of space during the initial invasion. She thought about the millions of soldiers and civilians who had already sacrificed their lives. She thought about everything humanity had given just to stay in the fight. And then her decision was made. General, how many of our special assault teams are still active? We've got about a dozen units still capable of offensive ops, he replied. Most are spread thin across the globe fighting a guerrilla war. Get them back, she ordered. Get all of them. I have a new target for them. What kind of target? Stone asked. Chen looked up at the tactical screen, at the swarm of enemy ships hanging in orbit, thousands of them. Any one of them could wipe a city off the map, an impossible target for any normal attack. But humans had stopped playing by normal rules a long time ago. We're going to board their flagship, she said, her voice filled with cold resolve. We're going to take out their commander, and we're going to show them that no matter how far they run or how high they fly, we will hunt them down and we will make them pay. Stone just stared at her. That's a suicide mission. We don't have ships that can get our people up there. We have their ships, she countered. Every team that's been fighting on the ground has captured Varith gear, Varith vehicles. Some of them have even captured their shuttles. Stolen shuttles with stolen codes, Stone argued. The enemy will spot them a mile away. Not if we launch the biggest, loudest, most distracting attack in history at the exact same time, she explained. Something so massive they'll be too busy to notice a few little shuttles slipping through the chaos. Stone chewed on that. The plan was insane. It was beyond desperate. It was the kind of long shot that had absolutely no business working. In other words, it was a perfectly human plan. What kind of attack are we talking about? He asked. Everything, she said. Everything we have left, every missile, every gun, every single plane that can still get off the ground. We throw it all at them at once, and while they're fighting off that storm, our teams sneak in and hit the flagship. And if the teams fail, Stone asked, then we all die anyway, she said grimly. At least this way, we die swinging. Stone gave a slow, determined nod. I'll start making the calls. Do it now, she said. We're running out of time. While the president set her desperate plan into motion, another one was already taking shape on the ground. In the ruins of what was once Chicago, a group of 50 soldiers was gearing up for a mission they knew they probably wouldn't come back from. They were the Hellhounds, one of the top special operations units in the entire American military. They'd been bleeding the Varith dry since day one, ambushing patrols and blowing up supply lines. Now they had a new job. Get on the enemy flagship, kill the commander, and save the world. Simple, right? Their leader was Sergeant Maria Santos. She was 32 years old with dark hair and eyes that had seen far too much. The invasion's first salvo had erased her entire family, her parents, her brother, her sister, her husband, and her 2 little kids, all vaporized in a single flash of light. She had absolutely nothing left to live for, which meant she had plenty to die for. All right, listen up, she said to her team, her voice calm and steady. This is a one-shot deal. We have 1 shuttle, 1 chance to get on that ship, and 1 shot at their high commander. If we screw this up, humanity is history. But if we pull this off, we might just buy everyone back home enough time to actually win this war. Sarge, how are we supposed to get past their security? A young soldier asked nervously. That ship has a crew of 10,000. Even if we make it on board, we'll be outnumbered 200 to 1. We don't have to fight 10,000, she replied. We just have to get to the bridge. Intel says the Varith command structure is all centralized in one place. Take out their commander and the entire fleet falls into chaos. Then we blow the ship's reactor and take as many of those monsters down with us as we can. The soldier listening just nodded. He couldn't have been more than 20, a kid who was still in boot camp when the invasion began, but his eyes were like stone and his hands were steady. This war had made him old. "Let's do this," he said. Sergeant Santos scanned her team. 50 soldiers, every single one a volunteer, and every one of them knew this was a one-way trip. They were a mix from every branch of the military, from every walk of life, men, women, old veterans, and fresh-faced rookies. The only thing they all shared was the will to give everything to save their world. "The shuttle leaves in 1 hour," Santos announced. "Get your gear, say your prayers, write your letters home. Because when we get up there, I want you to remember who we're fighting for. Remember everyone we've lost, and make the bastards pay." The hour vanished in a heartbeat, way too fast. Before she knew it, Santos was strapped into a stolen enemy shuttle, watching Earth shrink below her. The ship climbed through the atmosphere, broadcasting stolen security codes to any vessel that challenged it. So far, the codes were holding. The Vareth were too distracted by the massive attack President Shen had launched to notice one tiny shuttle. Through the window, Santos watched the battle unfold. Thousands of missiles soared up from Earth like angry fireflies, all streaking toward the enemy fleet. Waves of fighter jets flew on suicide missions, their pilots knowing they stood no chance but attacking anyway. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she'd ever seen. As they neared the flagship, the pilot's voice came over the comms. "They're hailing us." "Use the codes," Santos ordered. "I am. They're buying it. They're directing us to a landing bay on the port side." "Take us in." The shuttle slipped into the landing bay of the Eternal Conquest without a problem. Santos waited for the massive bay doors to seal behind them before she gave the order. "Go. Fast and quiet. Take down anyone who sees you." The hellhounds erupted from the shuttle like demons unleashed, moving through the corridors with terrifying efficiency. With the enemy's own Vareth weapons in their hands, they tore through the ship's corridors like ghosts. A muffled shot, the whisper of a blade, the snap of a neck in the shadows. That's all it took. The Vareth soldiers fell and never got back up. They were completely blindsided by an attack from the inside. All their attention was on the human ships and missiles smashing uselessly against their shields outside. They never dreamed human soldiers were already creeping through their own vessel. By the time the first alarms began to chime, Sonos and her team were already halfway to the bridge. "Contact up ahead," a scout whispered over the comms. "Security checkpoint, 20 guards." "Grenades," Sonos commanded softly. "On my signal." The team pulled the pins in perfect, deadly unison. The explosions ripped through the checkpoint in a flash of light and shrapnel, taking out most of the guards in a single heartbeat. Any who survived were silenced before they could even think to raise an alarm. The team, known as the Hellhounds, pushed on, leaving nothing but carnage behind them. Up on the bridge of the warship known as the Eternal Conquest, Commander Vathul wasn't even looking at the frantic internal alarms flashing on his console. He was mesmerized by the space battle on the main view screen. "Their attack is a complete failure," he boasted to his second-in-command. "Our shields are holding strong. Their weapons can't even scratch our paint." "Yes, High Commander," Torrance replied cautiously. "But we are losing ships. They're hitting our weak points with an unnerving accuracy." Vathul just waved a dismissive hand. "It doesn't matter. As long as the flagship stands, we control the fleet. Continue preparing the bombardment." "High Commander, I'm getting reports of weapons fire inside the ship. Our security teams aren't responding." Vorthkul finally tore his eyes away from the tactical display. "What?" It appears humans have boarded us, sir. They're on their way to the bridge." For a second, Vorthkul couldn't even make sense of the words. Humans? On his ship? It was impossible. No shuttle could have made it through their defenses. And then he remembered the chaos of the battle, the thousands of signals jamming their sensors, the overwhelming attack that had drawn every single eye outward. It was all a distraction. The entire massive assault was nothing but a trick to sneak a handful of soldiers on board. "How many?" he demanded. "Unknown. Initial reports suggest fewer than 100. 100 soldiers against 10,000? Vorthkul let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "They're insane. Send every security team we have. I want them all dead." But the hellhounds weren't waiting around to be killed. They were moving with incredible speed, faster than the Vareth could react. Every second brought them closer to their goal. Santos was leading the charge. She'd lost 10 soldiers getting this far, and 10 more were wounded, but they were almost there. She could see the bridge doors just ahead. They were massive barriers of reinforced metal. "Explosives!" she yelled. "Maximum yield!" Her demolition expert got to work planting the charges while the rest of the team desperately held off the Vareth security forces that were finally catching up. The corridor behind them turned into a slaughterhouse, bodies piling up as the humans fought to hold their ground. "Charges are set! Everyone get back!" The explosion blew the bridge doors clean off their hinges. Santos was already through the smoke before they hit the ground, her weapon firing at anything that moved. The bridge was pure chaos. Officers were scrambling for their weapons, guards trying to form a defensive line. And right in the center of it all, standing in front of the main view screen, was the alien who had ordered the destruction of her world. Vorthkul. Santos didn't even hesitate. She raised her rifle and fired. The shot slammed into Vorthkul's chest, sending him staggering backward. But the Vareth were tough. Their bodies could absorb damage that would kill a human instantly. He was still on his feet, reaching for his own weapon. Santos fired again and again and again. Each shot hammered Vorthkul further back, green blood spraying from his wounds. His 4 eyes were wide with shock. This couldn't be happening. He was a conqueror of worlds. He couldn't die here, killed by these primitives. But he was dying. He could feel it. "You," he gasped, "you're just animals." Santos walked right up to him. She was wounded now too. Cuts and burns covered her body, but her eyes were like ice, and her hands were rock steady. "We're humans," she said calmly, "and we don't surrender." She pressed the barrel of her rifle against his head and pulled the trigger. High Commander Vorthkul, conqueror of 2,000 worlds, died on the bridge of his own flagship, killed by a species he thought was beneath his notice. Santos had no time to celebrate. More Varath were coming. She looked at her surviving soldiers. Only 6 of them left. Just 6. "Set charges on the reactor," she ordered. "Use all of them." "Sergeant, if we blow the reactor this close—" "I know," she said, a sad final smile touching her lips. "We always knew this was a one-way trip. Let's make it count." The charges were set. The countdown began. Santos found a security camera and stared right into it, knowing that somewhere down on Earth, her people were watching. "Tell the president we got him," she said. "Tell her the hellhounds send their regards." She raised her hand in one last salute. The reactor exploded. The eternal conquest was ripped apart from the inside out. The explosion vaporized the bridge, the corridors, the landing bays. It spread outward in a tidal wave of fire that swallowed everything in its path. Secondary explosions erupted as weapons and fuel stores cooked off. The flagship shattered into pieces, each one trailing fire and debris. And when the blasts finally faded, there was nothing left but a cloud of wreckage. In orbit, above Earth, the Varath fleet was suddenly leaderless. Ships that had been moving in perfect sync began to drift aimlessly. Captains who had been following orders suddenly had no orders to follow. The chain of command was broken. Down on Earth, President Chen watched the flagship die. She watched her people's incredible sacrifice pay off, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel a glimmer of hope. The war was far from over, but she now believed humanity might actually survive. "God bless you, Sergeant Santos," she whispered. "God bless all of you." And somewhere in the fiery wreckage of the eternal conquest, Maria Santos smiled one last time before the fire took her. She had won. Humanity would live on. The death of High Commander Vorthkul changed absolutely everything. For 6 days, the Varath fleet had acted like a single weapon, guided by one mind and one will. Every ship knew its place. Every captain followed orders without question. Their chain of command had been perfect and unbreakable. But now, that chain was shattered. The new acting commander, Torinth, stood in the emergency command center of his cruiser, the Blade of Justice. He'd been coordinating the ground bombardment from orbit when the eternal conquest exploded. Now, he was the highest-ranking officer left alive. "How many did we lose?" he asked. His voice was hollow, completely empty. "The flagship and 93 escort ships were caught in the blast," a tactical officer reported. "High Commander Vorthkul is confirmed dead, along with most of the command staff." "What's our current fleet strength?" "Roughly 6,800 ships, Commander, down from 9,900 when the invasion started." Torrance closed his eyes. Over 3,000 ships lost, millions of soldiers dead. For what? They hadn't even conquered half the planet yet. The humans still held most of their major cities and controlled their resources. Every single time the Varith thought they had them beaten, the humans found a way to strike back. And now, this. A tiny group of soldiers, maybe 50 at the most, had boarded the most heavily defended ship in the entire fleet and killed the High Commander. Even after 200 years of living, after bringing dozens of star systems to heel in countless wars, Commander Torrance had never witnessed anything like this. The humans had died, yes, but in doing so they had won. He was supposed to be a conqueror, but right now he felt like a survivor of a massacre. How could a primitive species push a galactic empire to the brink? You're about to find out. "Commander," his tactical officer's voice trembled slightly, "what are your orders?" Torrance remained silent, the ghost of his predecessor's final command haunting him, an order to shatter the planet's very crust. He pictured the Dominion Council, waiting for news of another easy victory. He saw his own soldiers, still fighting, still being torn apart down on that world. And he thought about the humans. He'd studied them, watched them, and seen things that defied all logic. He saw soldiers who would smile as they charged into a wall of plasma fire that would surely vaporize them. He saw ordinary people in street clothes, heaving chunks of concrete at his advanced war machines. He saw children, actual children, wiring explosives to themselves just to take out a single enemy patrol. It was an entire species that treated death not as a defeat, but as one final, terrible weapon to be hurled at its foes. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to make the Vath pay for every inch of ground. Every single ship the Vath lost, every soldier that fell, that was a victory in their eyes. They would fight until the last human heart stopped beating, and even then, Torrance had a chilling suspicion they'd find a way to keep going. "Commander," the tactical officer pressed. Torrance's eyes snapped open. "Signal all ships," he said, his voice flat. "We're pulling out." A stunned silence fell over the bridge. Every single officer spun around to stare at him, their faces masks of disbelief. "Sir, did you just say pulling out?" "I did," Torrance confirmed. "We can't win this war. Every day we linger here, we bleed more ships and more soldiers. These humans have weapons that shouldn't exist, tactics we can't predict, and a level of determination that's frankly insane. If we stay, we will all die here." "But the Council," another officer started. "The Council isn't here," Torrance snapped. "They aren't the ones watching their soldiers die by the thousands. They're not seeing their starships ripped to shreds by impossible technology. I am here. I am in command, and I say we are leaving." He fixed his gaze on the communications officer. "Relay my orders to the entire fleet. All ships are to cease combat operations and prepare to jump to hyperspace. All ground troops are to return to their transports on the double. We are gone in 2 hours." "Yes, Commander?" The command shot across the system. On the decks of 1,000 ships, captains and crews heard the news with a mix of shock and utter relief. Some were just grateful to escape the meat grinder. Others felt a surge of fury, believing this retreat was a betrayal of every comrade they'd lost. But without question, every single one of them obeyed. Torrance was in charge now, and his word was absolute law. On the planet's surface, the Vath war machine ground to a halt and began its slow, painful retreat. Soldiers who'd known nothing but pushing forward were now ordered back to their landing zones. Tanks that had been blasting their way through cities suddenly turned and rumbled back toward their transports. The humans watched them go, their suspicion palpable. Was this some kind of trick? A new, twisted strategy? Deep in her command bunker, President Chen stared at the reports, refusing to believe them. "They're leaving?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Just like that?" "It seems so, Madam President. General Stone confirmed, his own voice tight with disbelief. Our satellites show their fleet pulling back, moving past the moon. They're gathering into what looks like a jump formation. But why now? Chen pressed. They still have thousands of ships. They could have hammered us from orbit, cracked the planet open like they threatened. I think Sergeant Santos's mission changed the equation, ma'am. She didn't just take out their high commander. She shattered their spirit. Chen considered that. The Voth had never known defeat. They'd never encountered a species that could hit them back this hard. The assassination of their supreme leader by a handful of soldiers on a one-way mission must have terrified them. If a few determined humans could do that, what else were they capable of? The Voth weren't retreating because they were beaten. They were retreating because they were scared. Track them, Chen ordered, her voice hardening. I want to be sure they're actually gone. And if they even think about turning around, you hit them with every last bullet we have. Yes, Madam President. In orbit, Torrance watched his battered fleet limp into position. Ships streamed from every corner of the system, trying to form the massive, precise pattern required for a coordinated jump. The withdrawal was going as smoothly as could be expected, but reports from the ground were getting worse. Commander, multiple ground units are taking heavy fire, an operations officer reported. The humans aren't letting them leave. Tell them to fight their way out, Torrance ordered, his jaw tight. We don't leave anyone behind. Sir, that will mean more casualties. I know, Torrance said quietly. Do it anyway. Of course the humans wouldn't make it easy. Even as victors, they were going to wring every last drop of blood from their invaders. Torrance found a strange, grudging respect for them, even as he hated them for what they'd done. These weren't primitives. These were warriors. As the agonizing hours ticked by, the fleet continued to shrink. Ships too damaged to survive the jump were simply abandoned. Soldiers who couldn't make it to a transport were left to their fate. It was a brutal, ugly calculus, but it was necessary. When the fleet was finally assembled, Torrance asked for the final tally. Fleet strength is at approximately 4,200 ships, the tactical officer said, his voice hollow. We've managed to recover about 1.5 million ground troops. 4,000 ships. They had arrived with almost 10,000. More than half their fleet was gone, destroyed or left behind as floating tombs. And our casualties? Torrance asked. It's hard to be precise, Commander. But preliminary estimates are around 3 million dead, including High Commander Varathk and his entire command staff. 3 million. All dead on a world they thought they'd conquer before lunch. Torrance gave a slow, heavy nod. Begin the hyperspace jump. Yes, Commander. Across the fleet, massive engines began to whine, and energy fields coalesced around each ship, preparing to rip open the fabric of space. And that's when the humans unleashed hell. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Missiles, previously hidden among the debris fields, ignited their engines. Drones that had been playing dead suddenly powered up. Weapons platforms on the moon that had been silent for days fired their last rounds for this one perfect moment. The Voth shields were down, a necessary step for the jump. They were completely exposed. Ships just started to vanish. Railgun slugs, moving at a fraction of light speed, tore through hulls like they were paper. Missiles found engine cores and turned warships into new suns. Plasma cannons raked across the formations, and vessels melted into molten slag. All ships, emergency jump, Torrance roared. Jump now! Go! The fleet scrambled to obey. Portals to hyperspace, like glowing purple wounds, began to tear open in the darkness. Ships dove for them, desperate to escape the slaughter. But the humans had one last surprise. Gravitational mines, hidden near the designated jump point, suddenly activated. They warped the space around them, destabilizing the hyperspace portals. Ships that dove in weren't met with escape, but with annihilation. Their crews died screaming as their vessels were simultaneously stretched and crushed by the warring forces of physics. Torrance could only watch in horror as his fleet was systematically erased around him. Ships he had served on for centuries, crews he had known for decades, all of them snuffed out in a flash. Recalculate jump coordinates, he yelled. Find us a clear path out of this. Working on it, Commander. The distortions are making it almost impossible. More ships exploded. The humans were throwing everything they had left at them. This was their final, spiteful goodbye, and it was devastatingly effective. The flagship, the Blade of Justice, shuddered violently as a railgun slug grazed its shields. Torrent gripped the arms of his command chair, refusing to show the terror he felt. "Status! Got one. Jump coordinates recalculated. We have a clean path, but it's a narrow window. We'll lose more ships just getting to it." "Do it," he commanded. "All ships, follow my lead." The Blade of Justice surged forward toward the new jump point, with what remained of the fleet desperately trying to follow. Behind them, the humans kept firing, kept killing. The jump point loomed closer. Torrent watched the tactical display, his heart sinking as he saw the number of friendly ships plummet. 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. The Blade of Justice plunged into the portal, and the universe dissolved into a tunnel of purple light, leaving the chaos behind. For the first time in hours, Torrent let himself take a breath. How many made it?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. The tactical officer stared at his console, his face ashen. 17, Commander," he whispered. 17 ships made it through. 17. Out of 9,900. Torrent slumped in his command chair, silent. There were no words. The invasion of Earth was over. The Vath had lost. The trip back to Dominion space took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of utter silence, of mourning, and of trying to process the impossible. Torrent spent most of it locked in his quarters, drafting his report for the Dominion Council, the hardest words he had ever had to write. He wrote about human technology that defied their understanding. He wrote about their tactics, how they could adapt and evolve faster than any species he'd ever seen. He wrote about their sheer willpower, their absolute refusal to surrender even when faced with total extinction. And then he wrote his final recommendation. When the 17 surviving ships arrived at the Dominion capital, they were met by a fleet of pristine escorts and brought directly to the council chambers. Torrent found himself standing before the assembled leaders of the Dominion, the most powerful beings in 3 galaxies. They stared down at him with expressions of pure disgust and rage. He was a failure, a coward who had retreated. He had dishonored the Dominion. "Explain yourself, Commander," the High Counselor hissed. "How did you manage to lose an entire invasion fleet to a planet of primitives?" Torrent stood tall. "Imagine sending 10,000 of your most advanced warships to conquer what you think is a primitive, backwater planet. Now, imagine only 17 of those ships limping home, battered and broken. That's the nightmare Commander Torrent had been living for 3 weeks, and he knew that telling the Dominion Council the truth might get him executed, but he had to. "They are not primitive," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "They only seem that way because they haven't spread to the stars yet, but their technology adapts at a terrifying rate. Their tactics are brilliant, and their will to fight. It's like nothing we have ever faced. You gave me 10,000 ships. They shattered our fleet. We wiped out millions of their people, and they just fought harder. We turned their cities to glass, and they kept fighting. We bombed their world from orbit, and they kept fighting. They don't surrender. They don't know how to quit. They fight until they win, or until every last one of them is dead." The council chambers were silent, until one of them scoffed. "Then we'll just send a bigger fleet. 20,000 ships, 30,000, whatever it takes." Torrent slowly shook his head, a weary gesture from a 200-year veteran of war. "It won't make a difference. You could send every ship we have, and it still wouldn't be enough. By the time that fleet arrived, the humans would have new weapons, new defenses. They will have learned from our mistakes. They will be stronger." He locked eyes with each council member one by one. "I have fought for 2 centuries. I've conquered worlds that would make the Vath look like toddlers playing with sticks. But I have never, ever faced an enemy like the humans. They aren't like us. They aren't like any species we've ever met. There's something new, something terrifying." The High Counselor leaned forward. "What is your recommendation, Commander?" Torrent took a long, heavy breath. "Avoid them at all costs. Do not attack them again. Do not provoke them. If we can manage it, don't even let them know we exist anymore. Leave their planet alone and pray to whatever gods you have that they never decide to come looking for us." The chamber exploded. Council members leaped to their feet, shouting, calling him a coward, a traitor. Torrance didn't flinch. "I'm telling you the truth," he said over the noise. "You can kill me for it, but it won't change the facts. We attacked their world, which they call Earth, with 9,900 warships. 17 came back. 17. That is the reality you have to face." With a single gesture, the High Counselor silenced the room. "You honestly believe they are that dangerous?" Torrance's gaze was unwavering. "I believe they are the single most dangerous species we have ever encountered. And it's not because of their weapons or their ships," he continued. "It's because of who they are. They're survivors. They adapt. They learn. They take a beating that would shatter any other race, and they get back up, stronger. They never, ever give up." His mind flashed back to the chaos on his flagship's bridge. He remembered the face of a human sergeant, a woman who had somehow fought her way aboard, smiling as she took down the High Commander. "If we go back there, we will all die. That isn't a guess, that is a certainty." The council argued for hours, but in the end, fear won. Humanity was officially classified as a forbidden species. Their home world was flagged with the highest possible threat level in the Dominion's archives. A standing order was issued. All ships were to avoid their solar system by a minimum of 10 light years. As for Torrance, he was sentenced to exile for his catastrophic failure. He accepted it without protest. He had saved the crews of his 17 surviving ships. He had given his people the warning. It was the best he could do. Boarding the transport that would carry him to a forgotten moon, he glanced back at the star charts. Out there, orbiting a small yellow sun, the humans were likely already rebuilding, learning, and getting stronger. He had told the council they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. But he hadn't told them the whole truth. He hadn't told them about the look in that human sergeant's eyes as she ended High Commander Varul. It wasn't hate or rage or even fear. It was something else entirely. Something Torrance had only ever seen in the eyes of the most legendary warriors of his own people. It was pure, unadulterated joy. The humans didn't just fight to survive. They didn't just fight to protect their homes. They fought because they loved it. War was in their blood, in their bones, woven into the very fabric of their souls. And now, thanks to the Dominion, they knew they weren't alone in the universe. They knew the galaxy was full of new places to see, new challenges to conquer, and new enemies to fight. Torrance stared into the void and felt a deep chill. The Dominion leadership thought their quarantine would work. They thought that by marking Earth as a no-go zone, they could keep themselves safe. They were fools. The humans weren't going to stay put forever. They would build new ships, better ships, and they would come exploring in the dark between the stars. Sooner or later, they would find the Dominion. And on that day, the fact that 17 ships had escaped would seem like a stunning miracle. 40 years later, Torrance's silent prophecy came true. Human ships appeared on the edge of Dominion space. They weren't warships, not on the outside. They arrived with their weapon ports closed and their communication channels open, broadcasting messages of peace and a desire to trade. But everyone who saw them knew the stories. Everyone knew what happened at Earth. The humans were met with a mixture of fear and awe. They were given everything they asked for: trade deals, diplomatic embassies, access to markets and technology. No one had the courage to say no. And when the first human ambassadors walked the halls of the Dominion Council, the few members old enough to remember Torrance's warning looked at them with absolute terror. These were the people who had annihilated a fleet of nearly 10,000 ships. These were the people who had charged plasma cannons with nothing but crude projectile weapons and pieces of sharpened metal. These were the people who had smiled as they died, because they knew their sacrifice would secure victory. Humanity had earned something far more valuable than treaties or trade goods. They had earned it with blood and fire. They had earned fear. And in a galaxy filled with predators, fear was the most valuable currency there was. One of the human ambassadors, a young woman named Elena Santos, stopped in front of the massive memorial the Dominion had built for their lost fleet. The wall was a colossal structure, listing the name of every single soldier and ship lost in the invasion of Earth. She studied the names for a long moment before turning to the Dominion official beside her. "My grandmother fought in that war," she said, her tone conversational. "She was the one who led the team that killed your high commander." The official's face went white. I'm so very sorry for your loss." Elena just smiled. "Don't be. She died exactly how she wanted to, fighting and winning." It was the same chilling smile her grandmother had worn on the bridge of Torrance flagship right before the end. "We remember her as a hero," Elena continued. "One of the people who saved our entire species. I imagine you remember her as something else." "We remember her as a warning," the official admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Good." Elena's smile widened just a little. That's exactly what she would have wanted. She turned and walked away, leaving the official frozen in front of the memorial. He watched her go, the old, cold fear creeping back into his heart. The humans were here. They were smiling. They were trading. They were signing treaties. But everyone knew the truth. Underneath the pleasantries, they were the same terrifying species from the legends. The galaxy would never, ever forget the day that 9,900 warships attacked a little blue planet, and only 17 escaped to tell the story. That story spread to every known star system. It became a legend, a myth, and finally, a core piece of advice passed down through generations. Do not provoke the humans. Do not threaten their world, and never mistake their kindness for weakness. Because when humans are pushed to fight, they don't stop. They never stop. And in the end, they always win. That is the legacy of Earth. That is the legacy of humanity. And that is why the galaxy learned to live in fear of a small, quiet world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. And it's why, to this very day, no one has ever been foolish enough to try invading Earth again.